Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Aiza Umar. Now, despite US President Trump's reassurances that the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant is almost eliminated, the latest standoff between US-backed Syrian forces against a small pocket of ISIL fighters continues in Baghuz. But the question remains that after this decisive battle, is the civil war in Syria coming to a close? Camps for the internally displaced are filling up fast, with mostly women and children, raising concerns from humanitarian organizations. The fact remains that the conflict has stolen millions of childhoods and left them traumatized, vulnerable to exploitation, and lacking access to basic rights as education and clean water. Red Cross officials fear the overburdened Al-Hol camp in northeastern Syria, which has been, in recent weeks especially, inundated with civilians and ISIL fighters fleeing from Baghuz, is on the brink of collapse. A report issued by the United Nations International Children's Fund's Emergency Fund has declared 2018 as the deadliest year for children in Syria since the war began 9 years ago. Now, according to this report, more than 1,100 children were killed last year alone, and most of these deaths occurred due to unexploded ordnance. Today, we are trying to understand the situation in Syria on the ground from those who have reported on it and work closely with the displaced. And also, we will be talking to anti-war activists and experts on the future of Syria. To begin today's program, I'd like to introduce two of my guests who are joining us from parts of the world. First of all, we have Ms. Maram Susli, who is an activist, anti-war activist, and also with us is Ms. Nora Nyland, who is a co-founder of the NGO United Against Inhumanity. Welcome to Newswire. I want to start with you, Ms. Maram. You have been very vocal in terms of what exactly is the situation in Syria in terms of international regional players. If you could highlight what, in your view, is US's role in trying to resolve the conflict.
I think it's quite the opposite. The US isn't having a role of resolving the conflict. In fact, they had the role of creating and prolonging the conflict to this day. I mean, the US is illegally occupying Syria against international law. They have no UN mandate, and they don't have invitation from the Syrian government, which is a sovereign nation. They are funding militias and fighting ISIS, but in the first place, they're providing of weapons and support to militias to try to regime change Syria is the reason why Al-Qaeda and ISIS has been empowered. In fact, you know, the groups that the US gave arms to and support, including bombing Syria for, not only are they ideologically aligned to ISIS and fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, but in fact, they are guilty of much larger human rights violations, including beheading children, eating hearts, and bombing civilians. I mean, they are equivalent to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And of course, you know, even when it comes to the militias such as the YPG, that they are now, or SDF they call, that they are fighting ISIS alongside, you know, they have also been accused of ethnically cleansing the Sunni population in the east of the Euphrates region of Syria, as well as the Assyrian Christian population, which they have forcibly disarmed in some cases and assassinated the leaders of. So the problem with the US occupation is not only that it is preventing Syrian military from taking care of these terrorist groups, sometimes bombing Syria if it gets too close, but also occupying the oil wealth of Syria and preventing Syria from using its resources.
So if you were to highlight, Maram, if you were to highlight for us in a few words, what is the main motive? Because there was seen an attempt to withdraw US forces by President Trump, and now, of course, news is that 200 more soldiers will remain on the ground. So what, in your view, is the intention of them staying there or staying involved in Syria?
It's divide and conquer. The aim is that they want to establish a separate state east of the Euphrates, or federalize Syria, in order to balkanize the country, prevent or delay its rebuilding. Because at the end of the day, the US is strategically allied with Israel, and they're doing this because it benefits Israel.
It benefits Israel, and also at the cost of the human lives there. It's an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, one of the biggest conflict zones in the world today, catching headlines. And here, before the presidential 2020 race begins, President Trump is obviously trying to weigh in on his voters. Doesn't this harm his, this intention, if it were true, doesn't it harm his securing another term?
Absolutely. I mean, the problem was that he ticketed and won on the basis that he was going to end regime change wars and pull troops out of Syria. And when he did say that he was going to pull troops out of Syria, he even, talked about how the fallen U.S. soldiers would be happy with it. Everyone was pleased. But of course, his circle that he allowed to be around him reined him in. And of course, this is going to weaken his next presidential bill because it has lost a lot of his base support, as well as the fact that there is many other promises that he failed to achieve.
So what do you think is the way forward? Where is the Arab world's involvement when it comes to resolving the issue in Syria?
Unfortunately, the Arab world has been aligned with the United States. They were led to believe that the war in Syria will be quickly over, that they will be able to regime change the Syrian government and install their own puppets. And they were instrumental in funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the other militia groups. Qatar especially was one of the largest funders of the Al-Qaeda group that's currently in Idlib. And Turkey has been no help as well. If they were to change perhaps their idea and pull back from this aggressive position, perhaps then they would be helpful.
All right. And here I'd like to pull in Ms. Noura Nalin, you into the conversation. Obviously, while the political turmoil continues at the cost of human lives, could you tell us a little about the UN Refugee Agency doing for displaced people in Syria? And also, first of all, highlight the humanitarian crisis for us.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Well, as we all know, Syria is entering the 9th year of this war, which has been absolutely devastating for civilians, women, children, and men. And that situation persists as the armed conflict eases a bit. It persists, but as the Assad regime has regained more territory, the situation of those who are affected, and it's more than half the population, have been uprooted, both as internally displaced people and as refugees. There is little prospect in the near future that they can have any, be able to live in inhumane conditions, given the situation on the ground and given the dynamics of the geopolitics that perpetuates the problem in Syria. In terms of the specific question about refugees, there are something like 5 million people who are uprooted outside the country, the majority in the region, also some here in Europe. It is unclear or difficult to see how those who fled the fighting over this past few years would entertain going back to a situation that is even more repressive in many instances than when they left.
That is a grave concern, and of course there's a lot of international funding required to support these refugees in various neighboring countries. But one of the things that the UNICEF report highlights is the very high number of children who have died in Syria last year, over 1,100.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the highest toll over this past 8-9 years. But unfortunately, it's not unusual that it's children who are often the most vulnerable will suffer the most. And as we've seen up in North Syria, the number of babies, not just kids, the number of newborn babies that have died since the conditions are so terrible. And I guess the mothers have also been not in a good health condition. So indeed, the situation of children is deplorable. Mm-hmm. And the extent to which concern about the humanitarian situation can override other geopolitical concerns is in doubt. Almost invariably, the situation of women and children, those who suffer the most, is often marginalized in these situations.
And it's not just the UNICEF report that exposes a very alarming situation. There are more reports that have come in. I believe you mentioned one report, the Commissioner of Inquiry highlights the humanitarian crisis in Syria. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, the Commission of Inquiry, it's a body that has grown out of, it's a product of the Human Rights Council, which is about to meet here in Geneva in the coming days. And that's actually operating in parallel to the donor conference in Brussels that started yesterday. What the Commission of Inquiry reports do is document the different types of problems that Syrians have been confronted with, from, for example, the very high level of arbitrary detention. And it's well known that the last figure I looked at was over something like 900,000 people have disappeared in detention, and where the conditions of torture and inhumane treatment has resulted in a lot of loss of lives. It looks at that. It looks at the different situations in different parts of Syria, up in Afrin, and again, the absence of the rule of law, and how the different warring parties, including non-state armed actors, is making life near impossible for the people living there.
There's also a great concern for children of foreign fighters as these camps are filling up with either the wives or the children of these foreign fighters. They are stuck between a sort of a no man's land situation. What will become of them?
Well, good question. It appears that there are some aid organizations involved, but with very limited access. The governments, because these ISIL fighters included a lot of non-Syrian fighters, including from Europe, and it seems that for the most part, with a few exceptions, governments are not prepared to have these people back, and that in effect means that the spouses and the children are also not accepted back. I mean, this is a real problem, and it shows the extent to which humanitarian values are wanting.
Right. And again, there is a big summit that is taking place in Brussels at the moment, which is being co-chaired by the EU and the UN. When these kind of events take place in order to highlight situations, this one is specifically for Syria, what is effectively the conclusion of these summits? Is there any effective on-ground resolution for the sake of the people who are in this stuck in this conflict?
Well, a major focus of the conference in Brussels, it's a fundraising effort. And at this point of the situation in Syria, support for humanitarian work, financial support for humanitarian work is facing a number of question marks, since there's a certain assumption that people will return or will be encouraged to return, to put it mildly, and then concerns about the extent to which support for humanitarian activities, including the regeneration of healthcare, education, food supplies, the extent to which that may be diverted to the Assad regime. So the concern then is that the traditional donors, and the bulk of donors for Syria have come from the West, that they're going to be less supportive than before. And again, then this results in a more difficult situation for people who need life-saving support.
So, and if you were to highlight the greatest concern right now for children and women in Syria, where they need the most help, and is there any part in Syria that has returned to normalcy?
Well, I think to use the word normalcy in Syria is a complicated term, but I mean, the Syrians in different parts of the country, of course, have suffered the same, but also suffered differently. I presume in the areas that were always under the Assad regime control are somewhat better off than those were subjected to more intense fighting. I mean, the broad answer to the question of what is needed for children and their families, it's peace. And it's a big discussion what will constitute a sustainable peace in Syria. Going on from that, from a human rights and a humanitarian perspective, I mean, there needs to be a basic rule of law that treats people, that allows people to enjoy their basic rights. People need to have access to basic services. I mean, the war has been devastating in lives. More than 500,000 people have been killed. But it's also been devastating in terms of the destruction of infrastructure. I mean, the Assad regime had a policy of deliberately destroying healthcare facilities. So that obviously is going to be a huge problem going forward. How to regenerate access to basic essential services that are vital for everyday living, whether this is food, clean water, healthcare, vaccinations, etc.
Right. And Mariam, here, as we are talking about reconstruction, it raises a big ethical question of whether the reconstruction of conflict zones after the war is over in itself is a business opportunity for stakeholders.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think some of the reluctance of the US or European states to put in money or support the reconstruction efforts in Syria is they see no financial gain from it at this point. Because the Syrian government is still in power, and they had hoped that they would get a new government installed that which would give them contracts where they could basically force Syria into a deep amount of unpayable debt and leech the resources from the country. I mean, the European and US states companies especially were rubbing their hands together thinking about all of these reconstruction contracts that they could possibly get once the war is over. And I think a lot of this feigned concern for humanitarianism or people is not genuine. I mean, the Syrian government was accused of destroying the health infrastructure. But before the war began, of course, Syria was 98% sufficient in creating its own drugs. But after the war, since especially in Aleppo, all the factories were looted by the rebels, a lot of the hospitals were being garrisoned and used for military purposes, the problem was that now Syria is really in need of outside support to get the healthcare and medicine that they need. However, the European states and the US, they have sanctions placed on Syria to prevent such healthcare from getting into the country. So again, they claim to care about humanitarianism and the Syrian people, etc., but then they are devastating Raqqa on one hand and preventing health care and medications from getting in the country, basically putting a siege on the entire Syrian people. And it's really just politics at the end of the day. Nobody really cares about people.
So the sanctions you mentioned, that they also sort of serve a different purpose altogether. And the people who suffer the most are the ones on the ground, the civilians. The situation in Idlib, for example, the demilitarized zone, which was supposed to be a safe haven for the civilians, just last few weeks we've seen reports of 59 children dead there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Idlib especially, that's one of the last vestiges of control of basically Al-Qaeda. I mean, the US State Department said that Al-Qaeda is the biggest group, Al-Nusra Front, or whatever they've changed their name to now. They are in control of the area. France and Europe, they seem to have no problem sending aid into that region in spite of the fact that it's being run by Al-Qaeda. So it's not so much that they are worried that such aid is going to be used by Assad regime or whoever's in power, because they really have no problem sending in aid to regions that are controlled by Al-Qaeda. And the best scenario would be for the legitimate sovereign state that is recognized by the United Nations to control all regions of Syria, obviously, and return law and order.
Let's hold that thought. Mariam, hold that thought. We want to talk about the proposed solutions that both of you have. But first, let me welcome another guest who's just joining us from Brussels, Mr. Fadel Abdul. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire. I understand you have very little time as you're involved in the third session that is being co-chaired by the EU and the UN on supporting the future of Syria and the region. Could you tell us a little about what you're hoping to achieve in this conference?
Thank you very much. But let me clarify one thing, that what your guest is saying is totally wrong. And any clear search through Google, they can reveal that lots of government funds have been stopped since Al-Nusra seized Idlib. And that's is very clear. And the past week I was in the U.S. and I visited State Department and I visited the White House as well, and I spoke with several officers in the U.S. and they never actually fund Idlib. So I don't know, from just throwing information, this is not the good way actually to talk as an expert, as a researcher. Regarding the Brussels conference, We hope to deliver our messages in Syria about the reconstruction mainly, and about the displaced people, the forced displaced people. First of all, regarding the reconstruction, we believe that the EU is committed to bind the reconstruction with the political solution, because otherwise it will be rewarding the criminals actually. Then regarding the displaced people, which is mainly about half of the Syrian population, we believe also that the circumstances inside Syria are still unsafe actually. And the refugees mainly didn't return it back to the area which have been displaced forcibly from there. Even if they are IDP inside Syria. Mm-hmm. So our monitoring showing that no one is returned, or maybe a very few limited family.
Right, but coming back to the conference, as you mentioned, not just to highlight the situation on the ground, but also to get more support for reconstruction in Syria, it brings the question really that how effective is it to be talking about reconstruction right now, where the situation like in Idlib, a demilitarized zone, has seen the situation worsen actually?
Yeah, actually, we need to confirm that the reconstruction will not start, and that's what we get actually, confirmation. So, as I mentioned, they commit to this issue because the Russian and the Iranian company, they want to be rewarded after they invested like billions of dollars in Syria. So they're pushing to say that everything in Syria is calm. The refugees have been back, and we need to start reconstruction. So this is a very, very clear message that the reconstruction will never start without political solution. And about the sanction as well, the continuous of sanction, that also affect the regime a lot, and the Iranian as well. And the Assad visit to Iran in order to try to avoid those sanctions actually.
So it still puts
sanction for the sanction itself. The sanction in order to pressure Assad to sit on the table in order to find a deal and lead our country to democratic country, to election, not only the family minority rule. This is what our country has been led since 50 years.
Right, but the concern still remains that if the military objectives are placed above civilian governance by all those concerned there in Syria, all parties, it essentially creates a vacuum for the rule of law.
Yeah, of course, but we need here to recognize between the Syrian regime and the other parties as well. Even the extremist group, the Syrian regime and his militia, mainly the Iranian militia as well, is responsible for about 90% from the total crimes have been committed in Syria, which is described by the Commission of Inquiry of Syria, crimes against humanity. This is widespread and systematic. The others committed crime, the extremist group, the opposition, the PYD, the Kurd PYD, the international coalition led by the US, the Russian forces, but those are about 10%. The total crimes committed by the government itself against their own population. And that's based on what we have been documented since 8 years by daily basis. So that's what our database reflected. This is not actually we are exaggerate the regime what he's doing. No, this is the reality actually. So when we are speaking about total and this recognition, as I mentioned, is this recognition you can find it in 14 reports of the experts of documentation from the United Nations.
Let me involve the other guests in this also, since we're running out of time. Madam, very quickly, your idea of how this will be resolved.
I mean, he's saying that there needs to be a political solution before reconstruction begins and before sanctions can be lifted. What this sounds like to me is that they're still insisting on their military their demands are basically that Syria should change its constitution and have federalism, to balkanize the country, to end support for the Hezbollah militia that threatens Israel. At the end of the day, what they couldn't achieve militarily in Syria, they're trying to now achieve with economic blackmail. And that's just punishing the Syrian people and not the government or the players. They're really just punishing people because they didn't get what they want out of the Syrian war at the end of the day. Of course, reconstruction will allow the infrastructure for refugees to return. Reconstruction starts first, economy rises, and then refugees will have a safe place to return. That's the way it is.
But obviously, peace
in Syria.
But obviously, peace has to play a big factor here. I mean, even before reconstruction starts and refugees return, if there is no government in place, if there is a continuation of a civil war, how is that going to be achieved? That's the big question here.
Well, there is a government in place. However, you're right in that this war is not going to be over and things are not going to get back to normal until that government that is in power takes control of every region of Syria that's currently being run by illegal militias or is currently being occupied by foreign powers. Nothing is going to change unless these things are, completed or over with. And that's why I can assure you that the next front is going to be the Idlib front, and the Syrian military, along with Russia, is going to go in.
Okay.
And in the past, the U.S. has threatened to bomb Syria if that happens, to protect the militias, the Al-Qaeda-linked militias that are controlling the place. But unless this war is over and the European and Western powers give up on their idea that they could influence change within Syria through weaponry or economic blackmail, nothing is going to change, and the suffering of people is going to continue.
Right. And Ms. Nora, we're coming to the end of this segment. Quickly, Save the Children have declared Syria the most dangerous place in the world for children. And as you heard both our guests, there is not a very easy consensus or a solution to this problem. Could you highlight for us what is at stake here when it comes to the people, the civilians on the ground?
What is at stake, as in any war-affected situation, the solution is dependent on going forward with an inclusive governance that recognizes and honors and respects and promotes the human rights of all its citizens. That's what's called positive peace. It is good that much of the armed conflict has diminished over this past year. That is a positive. However, having said that, more than 1.5 million people were displaced last year in Syria. So going forward, I think it needs to be understood how context in which the armed conflict began. It was Syrian people who objected to repression, and we all know what happened from that. To go forward and in a peace and to avoid the number of children currently being killed, for that to stop, the situation in which people are living, and it includes the political situation, needs to be addressed so that people can live normal, regular lives in a way where they do not have to be worried about barrel bombs or the deliberate destruction of healthcare facilities, sieges that were obliging people to go without food. I mean, there were sieges that didn't allow access to food, etc. So in the year 2019, let us hope and let us work for a Syria where the citizens of Syria can enjoy a modicum of peace and humanity.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Nora and Ms. Maram. Also, Mr. Fadel giving us time here on Newswire. With that, we will take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Now, moving on to our second top story of the day. With the clock ticking towards 29th March, the deadline for UK's exit from the EU, British MPs have voted overwhelmingly against the Prime Minister's withdrawal deal, yet again. Last time, Theresa May put the agreement to Parliament in January. She suffered a major defeat as the deal agreed with the EU after 18 months of painstaking negotiations was thrown out by a margin of 230 votes. The latest defeat raises pressure on UK Prime Minister Theresa May and increases the prospect of a Brexit delay or even a second referendum. To understand this better, first let's connect with our correspondent who yesterday was speaking to the people on the ground in London to understand their sentiments.
Well, today presents a significant challenge to Theresa May and her government. It is the day when members of the UK Parliament will vote on her deal for the UK to leave the European Union. It follows a failed attempt in January when MPs rejected her deal then by a significant majority, including members from her Conservative governing party that revolted. The main issues that remain, though, are over trade, but there is this contentious issue of the Irish backstop. That's between the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Many believe that that should remain open. She took it back to Brussels last night and got it in there just in time, she believes, for a policy, a term to remain in place, that the border can remain open. However, that cannot be a permanent feature for the UK's withdrawal from the European Union in the event the deal is accepted tonight by MPs. Nevertheless, the public remain very passionate over this issue, both on the Remain and the Leave side.
We vote for Brexit. When do we want it? Now.
And what if it's a hard Brexit?
Great. That's what we want.
Yeah.
That's what everybody voted for. Clean Brexit.
We are out. 29th of March. We are out.
Personally, for me, ever since the first referendum, I thought we needed to just ask people, are you sure? So you can call it whatever you want to, but I do think with such a massive change, which is not at all what was promised in the referendum, I think we should just ask people, are you sure this is what you want to do?
Well, there you have it, some very passionate voices there. We won't, of course, find out the outcome of the vote until an estimated time of around 7 or 8 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time tonight. That's when the MPs will vote on the deal, a deal that could change Britain and the European Union's landscape ahead. But in the event that deal is not accepted, MPs are scheduled to return tomorrow. Well, they will have to take that decision as to whether or not they believe that the UK should leave the European Union without a deal with Brussels. Joseph Hyatt, Indus News, London.
And the MPs did vote. Overwhelming majority of MPs voted against it. Now let me introduce our guest to better understand what the situation is. We have with our citizen rights campaigner from Belfast, we have Emma D'Souza, and also Professor Alex de Ruyter, Director of Centre of Brexit Studies, Birmingham City University. Welcome to the show, both of you. I want to start with you, Professor Alex. Overwhelming majority of MPs voted against the withdrawal deal. Why do people oppose the deal, Professor Alex?
Well, opposition to a deal has come from both sides. Crucially for European Research Group MPs, that's those hard Brexit Tories and the DUP of Northern Ireland. Their main concern with this agreement is that it did not have an explicit time limit put in place to the Northern Ireland backstop. Of course, for the DUP, with one of their politicians, Sammy Wilson, suggested that only the UK Parliament should be sovereign in regards to making that decision. So on the one side of the debate, you had that objection. On the other side, of course, you had the vast bulk of the Labour Party, all but a handful of their MPs and the opposition parties also vote against it because for them, it's not good enough. I mean, it's too hard a Brexit for them. And for the Labour Party, of course, their preferred approach is to have a permanent customs union with the EU. I'm not sure what practical difference that makes to having a backstop, which pretty much guarantees the same thing. But for both of those sides, Theresa May's agreement simply wasn't good enough. And the preferred approach of the Labour Party is still to try and force a general election on the back of this.
Now, Emma, bringing you into this conversation also, the backstop issue, a contentious issue right now that has created a lot of criticism from the public also. This, of course, rings close to home for you, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting to think about what the backstop is. The backstop is an insurance policy to protect the peace process and protect the Good Friday Agreement. And I think the fact that so many MPs are voting against the backstop and there's all this contention around the backstop represents a disregard for the Good Friday Agreement, because that is what the backstop is to protect.
Right. And could you tell us a little more about how this involves you personally, because it does bring into question the very citizenship, whether the Irish, they choose to be recognized as Irish or British?
Yes, I mean, that is a serious problem here in Northern Ireland. Under the Good Friday Agreement, the people of Northern Ireland have the birthright, whether they can be Irish or British or both. yet. And in that, there should be equal treatment and no differential treatment between the two communities. But with Brexit, we're seeing a hardening of identities in Northern Ireland, and people no longer have a choice, because if someone wants to be a British citizen but they'd like to have the same rights as their Irish neighbour, they have to go and get an Irish passport in order to do so. So there's a lot of questions being raised here in Northern Ireland about identity, about citizenship, about our EU rights. We're hearing a lot of talk about Irish citizens in Northern Ireland becoming second-class citizens post-Brexit, but at present we already are second-class Irish citizens, and what we're going to see is a deterioration of our rights as EU citizens post-Brexit.
Right. So, Professor Alex, then now what happens next?
Well, MPs will vote today, that's Wednesday UK time, on giving them a chance to say they don't want no deal. I mean, there's clearly no majority in Parliament for a no deal scenario, but of course that would still require the UK government to come up with a viable alternative to Theresa May's agreement that the EU would be willing to accept, and they're not going to renegotiate this agreement. So beyond that, then we get another proposed amendment on Thursday by a couple of politicians, Yvette Cooper, Oliver Letwin, seeking to extend Article 50. Now, it may well be, and most likely would be, that Theresa May would seek to try and get an extension for a couple of months anyway, in order to perhaps try and get some more time to pressure Parliament into accepting her deal, or no Brexit, as it were. But alternatively, that in effect might be taken out of her hands. It's very difficult to say. I think the one thing that is certain is that I would almost certainly bet that an extension of some sort will be in the offing, simply for no other reason than we're running out of time to put forward any viable alternatives to this current scenario. Right. And the clock is ticking in terms of no deal.
So, Professor Alex, is it also, it's expected today there will be a vote, and what is the sort of expectation of how that will turn out?
Oh, I think the vast majority of MPs will vote against no deal being a fallback position for the UK government in this regard. If that then happens, then the onus is on government and Parliament to come up with a credible alternative that the EU will accept. I mean, EU leaders have made it very clear that they're unlikely to accept an extension to this Article 50 period simply for the UK government to try and have more time to make up its mind. There needs to be some kind of plan in place for what the UK government wants to do. Right. Past indications have suggested that another referendum or a general election, for example, would be acceptable. But I don't think simply trying to buy enough.
Let me ask you, Emma, also what the sentiment is on the streets there in Belfast, if we are to talk about the options out there, soft Brexit, hard Brexit. I mean, what is the leaning towards mostly?
I mean, you have to remember that Northern Ireland voted to remain, and we are going to be the only part of the UK with a land border with the EU. So it's really important here that the border is open. The border for us is not just infrastructure, it's not just land, it's an emotional border. And any kind of infrastructure on that border represents going back to before the peace process with people here. But with the situation now and the no-deal vote that's happening this evening, I mean, I would expect and echo Alex's points there that there is an overwhelming majority against a no-deal. But at the same time, there is this misconception that keeping no deal on the table is a bargaining chip. Today we've seen released tariffs and information on a no-deal Brexit, and curiously in that we've seen that Northern Ireland will be treated differently from the rest of the UK in the event of a no-deal, and considering that's what they voted against last night, it's quite interesting to see that that's what's going to happen in the event of a no-deal.
Okay, hold on to that thought. Very quickly, let's hear what Joseph Hyatt, our correspondent in London, found out yesterday night after the vote.
Well, tonight, Theresa May's deal has been defeated 391 to 242. It's yet another blow for this current government and her leadership, which has been desperately seeking to arrange and negotiate a sufficient deal that would pass through Parliament, which failed to do so yet again. Theresa May appeared clearly affected by this circumstance when she appeared at the dispatch box. But the wider issue now, the wider question for the British public is what direction is the country heading in? And that is an unclear and certainly uncharted waters waters in the days ahead. Tomorrow, MPs will be given the opportunity to go before the House and to vote on whether they choose to take the UK out of the European Union with a no-deal Brexit, effectively taking us out without any clear clarity on trade, on customs union, etc. It would be a bit of an uncharted territory. Those on the Leave side have often been quite supportive of that idea. They want to take back control, as they call it, whereas by those on the Remain camp are optimistic that MPs will reject that concept of falling out crash hard with a hard Brexit, and instead will look towards Thursday, where on Thursday there is the hope, if it was rejected, there would be an opportunity for MPs to decide if they choose to extend Article 50. In the event that happens, those that wish to see the UK remain in the European Union are optimistic that that would open the doors to renewed negotiations, but also the possibility and opportunity to put into the equation the idea of a second referendum, or what they're calling a people's vote once again. Certainly on the streets behind us, those have come out to express their views throughout today. But this result was no real surprise. The MPs that we spoke to in the House earlier in the day were very confident that the deal would not pass, and that was evident throughout MPs on all sides of the House. The impact, of course, for the UK economy remains to be seen in the hours ahead, but there will be, of course, wider implications as we look towards Wednesday, and the implications and impact to follow.
Joseph Hyatt there for us from London. Now, the impact on the economy has already started to show. Professor Alex, the pound is down by more than 10% against the euro since the first referendum. The economy in UK, if you could talk a little more about this, how else is it being affected?
Well, the main effect, of course, as you point out, has been in terms of depreciation of the pound sterling, but we've increasingly had companies now in the manufacturing sector say that they will review operations in the UK, that new rounds of investment in the automotive sector, for example, with next generation of cars, electric vehicles and so on. These are now under threat. One key example we've already had is Honda announcing they will close down the Swindon plant in 2021. They denied Brexit was the tipping point, but in the past they've said that Brexit is a key concern for them. That's 3,500 jobs already earmarked for oblivion, plus more in the supply chain. Other companies such as Toyota and BMW have also indicated that they will review continued production and investment in the UK in light of the prospect of a no deal. So there's certainly a lot of pressure in that regard. The government, of course, has now announced contingency scenarios in the event of a no deal, that they would reduce tariffs on 87% of imports to zero in order to try and prevent any further price shocks to consumers and business. But it's clear the economy is taking a hit in this regard, and there's potential for further damage in that regard to come.
Further potential of damage to the economy. And Emma, what about the hospitality sector in Northern Ireland? Is that being visibly, is there a change being seen?
I would echo all those points there. The economy is definitely suffering, and not just in terms of hospitality, or all industries are suffering from Brexit with the uncertainty that's coming forward. Even in the likes of the NHS, we've seen a 90% drop in EU nurses. And I think I'd like to bring in that point that it's not just the economy, but it's also the free movement of people, and migration has been affected by Brexit, and that is having a wider effect on our communities as well.
So coming back to you, Professor Alex, it still remains to be seen, trying to figure out what the roadmap looks like in the future. Is there a possibility that the EU could decline when and if the UK asks for more time?
Well, to come back to my earlier point, I don't think the EU is simply likely to say yes for an extension just for more navel-gazing by government and parliament, more fudging, as it were. I think, as Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, has recently made clear, the EU will expect a credible plan from the UK in order to, to see how it goes forward. And I think ultimately that would have to hinge around, in all likelihood, I feel the only thing that would break this deadlock is another referendum. I don't think anything else will do it. So it would have to be something of that order of magnitude, I think. I think Juncker has indicated that, the UK could possibly have an extension to the end of May in order to not conflict with European Parliament elections, but there has to be something from the government and parliament to agree on, and they can present to the EU. That's the bottom line.
But there's also a concern, Emma, what happens if they do not vote for a delay?
Well, if they don't vote for a delay, even if they vote down no deal, it will still be a no deal Brexit, if that's just the way it is going to be on the 29th of March, if we don't reach an agreement with the EU. That's the reality.
And Professor Alex, I understand that it owns one member state in the EU to veto the extension. and many of them have a good reason for doing so, probably. So which member state can UK count on for that veto?
It's difficult to say. I mean, they will all come to a decision unanimously, as they put it. So I'd hate to single out any. I mean, you know, Macron typically has come in for criticism as taking a hard line against the UK, but I think it'd be a bit unfair to single out any one particular country in that regard. The key point, I think, is that the government is going to have to come up with a clear plan and justification for any extension. And, you know, to reiterate, you know, the default setting for the UK is no deal if it doesn't come up with anything credible in the next few days. And we really are talking the next few days.
Right. And Theresa May is obviously facing a lot of criticism ever since the Brexit thing came up. Is there a possibility that she could resign?
Well, she's shown remarkable persistence so far. I don't think Theresa May is going to leave of her own volition. I think she would have to be forced out. Of course, her party tried to have a vote of no confidence in her a couple of months ago, and she survived that, so she's immune from any further moves for another 9 months or so. Is it possible that Parliament might vote no confidence in the government if she reneges in any of these promised votes, for example? I don't know, but I think, you know, certainly the pressure is there building upon her. But I think it's most, if she goes, it'll be of her own volition. She's already said she won't contest the next election unless there's a snap election. But no, I don't think she'll be forced out this side of New Year, basically.
Okay. And Emma, very quickly, since we're running out of time, how, in your opinion, the UK manage its border with Ireland in the event if there is a no-deal Brexit?
There is just no way to imagine how they're going to manage the situation with the border in Northern Ireland. I mean, the reality is it will be a land border with the EU. There is going to be regulations and customs checks, and it's just inevitable there will have to be some kind of infrastructure or checks on that border. Now, they did release today in the no-deal preparations that products coming from Ireland into the north will not be tariffed, but the other way they will. So that is going to affect the farmers in the north who will be exporting to the south of the island, who will then face tariffs going into the EU. It's going to have a massive effect on the farmers and the economy here. So can't predict which way it's going to go, but whatever we do, it has to maintain peace in the island of Ireland. That's got to be the priority.
Thank you, Professor Alex and Miss Emma, for your contribution there to Newswire. With that, we've come to the end of the show. Stay tuned to Indus News for your latest updates. That's all from me. Goodbye.